Imagine dedicating years of your life to a family, raising their children as if they were your own, cooking their meals, keeping their home spotless, making sacrifices every single day, believing you were more than just an employee, believing you were part of something bigger, part of something that mattered, only to wake up one morning to the sound of fists pounding against your door, red and blue lights flashing through your window, voices yelling your name, demanding that you step outside, confusion flooding your mind as you unlock the door, only to be met with cold, unfeeling eyes and the sharp, unforgiving grip of officers who don't even give you a chance to speak before slamming handcuffs onto your wrists, your heart racing as they tell you that you're under arrest, your breath catching in your throat as they accuse you of stealing from the very people you had given everything to, the people who had smiled in your face, who had told you they trusted you, who had promised that you were family, only to turn around and brand you a criminal. Standing in their lavish home, tears in their eyes, pointing their fingers at you while the world watches, while the cameras flash, while the headlines spread like wildfire, convicting you before you even step foot inside a courtroom, the jury staring at you with eyes full of judgment, the prosecutor pacing back and forth, listing every piece of so-called evidence, the stolen jewelry, the fingerprints, the security footage, all painting you as a thief, all designed to destroy you, to bury you, to make sure no one ever questions whether you might be innocent, whether you might be telling the truth, whether this might all be a carefully constructed lie. And just when it seems like there's no way out, just when the walls are closing in, just when the gavel is about to come down, you stand up, you look them all in the eye, and with a voice steady, unwavering, filled with a quiet power no one saw coming, you say 6 words that bring the entire courtroom to a halt. I was never just a nanny. Vanessa Carter had always been the kind of woman people trusted, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone feel safe, the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, never raising her voice, never demanding more than she was given. Always doing her job with grace and patience, because that's just who she was, because that's how she was raised, because she believed that hard work and kindness would always be enough. But in the world she lived in the house where she worked, that was never going to be the case. For the past 5 years, she had dedicated every waking moment to the Holloway family, taking care of their 2 children as if they were her own, holding them when they cried, staying up with them when they were sick, celebrating their birthdays, teaching them the little lessons of life that their own parents were often too busy to teach. And for a long time, she had convinced herself that she was part of something good, that despite the obvious differences, the wealth, the privilege, the way she stood out as the only Black woman in an exclusive, predominantly white-gated community, she was safe here, she was wanted here, she was needed here. The mansion was pristine, every detail perfectly designed, from the grand staircase that spiraled up to the 2nd floor to the shimmering chandeliers that cast golden light across the marble floors, a world so far removed from the one Vanessa had grown up in, a world that had never really belonged to her, no matter how much time she spent in it. But behind those gleaming walls, behind the elegant dinner parties and carefully curated smiles, something was happening, something Vanessa could feel, but couldn't quite put her finger on. Something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up when she walked into a room and found hushed conversations cut short. Something that made her stomach twist when she caught Mrs. Holloway watching her a little too closely. When she heard whispers that stopped the moment she entered the room. When she noticed things being moved, small things, insignificant things at first, papers shuffled on a desk, a jewelry box slightly ajar, a door that was left open when she was sure she had closed it. Little things that added up, little things that started to feel like warnings, little things that made her wonder if the life she had built here was already beginning to crumble before her eyes. But she pushed those feelings down, because what else could she do? This was her job, this was her livelihood. This was her life, and she had worked too hard to let suspicion and paranoia creep in and take it away. She focused on the children, on their laughter, on the way they clung to her when they were scared, on the unconditional love they gave her. Because that was real, that was something no one could take away. And if she just kept her head down, if she just did what she was supposed to do, maybe, just maybe, everything would be fine. But Vanessa didn't know that the walls were already closing in, that decisions had already been made, that a plan was already in motion, and that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she gave, no matter how innocent she was about to become the center of a story she never asked to be a part of, a story where she would no longer be the trusted caregiver, the beloved nanny, the woman who had poured her heart into this family, but instead the villain, the accused, the woman whose name would be dragged through the mud in a way she never could have imagined, because behind the mansion's doors, something dark was waiting, something that had been building for months, something that was about to destroy everything she had spent years working for, and Vanessa Carter had no idea that the people she had given everything to were about to take it all away. It happened so fast, so seamlessly, so perfectly planned, that Vanessa barely had time to process what was happening before the walls of her world came crashing down around her. One moment, she was tucking the children into bed, their small hands wrapped around hers, their sleepy voices whispering their goodnights, and the next, she was standing in the middle of the Holloway's grand living room, staring at Mrs. Holloway's tear-streaked face as she clutched her chest in mock devastation, her voice shaking as she told the police that her jewelry, $50,000 worth of diamonds, gold, and heirlooms, had vanished without a trace. The words barely made sense. As the accusation hanging in the air like thick smoke, suffocating, surreal, impossible. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked at Mr. Holloway, searching his face for some kind of reason, some kind of understanding. But there was nothing, just the slight downturn of his lips, just the look of a man who had already decided how this story would end. She was the only one here. Mrs. Holloway sobbed, her voice breaking just enough to sound authentic, just enough to make the officers exchange knowing glances, Sui, too, just enough to seal Vanessa's fate before she even had the chance to defend herself. We trusted her, and there it was, the sentence that had been used for generations. The words that people like Vanessa had heard too many times before. We treated her like family, right before the knives came out, right before the betrayal, right before everything was ripped away. Vanessa shook her head, stepping forward, her pulse hammering, her throat dry. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice firm but calm, because she knew the truth, because she had done nothing wrong, because this was ridiculous. But Mrs. Holloway flinched, as if Vanessa had struck her. Taking a step back, clutching her pearls, her blue eyes wide with carefully curated fear, and Vanessa saw it then, the performance, the perfect act of a woman who had already set the stage, who had already written the script, knew exactly how this was going to play out. Mrs. Holloway whispered, her voice trembling just enough to sell the lie. "Just tell them where it is." The police didn't ask her any questions. They didn't hesitate. They moved in, their hands firm, their voices sharp as they told her she had the right to remain silent. As they twisted her arms behind her back, as cold metal clicked around her wrists, the children were crying now, standing at the top of the staircase, watching as the woman who had kissed their bruises, wiped their tears, and held them close was dragged away like a criminal. "Don't take her!" the little girl screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the flashing cameras, the neighbors stepping out of their homes to watch, the reporters already scribbling their headlines, the whispers that spread like wildfire. She fooled them. She was never one of them. She was never family. She was just a thief. And then it got worse, because the moment they searched her apartment, the moment they flipped over her mattress, rifled through her drawers, pried open her cabinets, the jewelry, hidden neatly in a shoebox in the back of her closet, Vanessa's breath left her body in one sharp, unforgiving moment. The kind of moment that rewired your brain, the kind of moment that made you realize you were trapped in something bigger than yourself. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible, but there it was. Undeniable, damning. The evidence they needed, the final nail in the coffin of the life she had built. She tried to tell them that she had never seen that shoebox before, that she had never touched that jewelry, that someone must have put it there. But they weren't listening. They weren't interested, because in their minds, they had already solved the case. The next time Vanessa saw daylight, she was in handcuffs, being led through a swarm of reporters, their voices like a violent storm around her, shouting her name, throwing accusations, pushing microphones toward her face, asking her how she could betray the people who had given her so much. And there, in the middle of it all, was Mrs. Holloway, standing on the steps of her mansion, her face streaked with carefully placed tears, shaking her head, her voice breaking as she told the world how heartbroken she was, how she had trusted Vanessa with everything, how she never could have imagined that someone who had been like family would betray her in such a horrible way, and the world believed her. They always did. The news ran with the story. Vanessa Carter, the trusted nanny, the woman they had all thought was kind, was smart, was hardworking, was nothing but a liar, a thief, a dangerous woman. Her mugshot was plastered across every screen, every newspaper, every headline twisting the knife deeper, turning her name into a symbol of deception, of betrayal, of disgrace. Neighbors she had once smiled at crossed the street to avoid her. Friends she had known for years stopped answering her calls. Strangers left hate-filled messages, calling her every name but the one her mother gave her. And as she sat alone in her jail cell, staring at the cold concrete walls, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her, she realized something. They had played their game well. They had taken everything from her, her job, her reputation, her dignity. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Vanessa wasn't just a nanny. She was something else. Something no one expected, and this story was far from over. The courtroom was ice cold, not just from the air conditioning humming softly in the background, but from the way every eye in the room was locked on Vanessa Carter, as if she had already been found guilty, as if this was just a formality, as if they were all waiting for the inevitable. The moment the judge would bang his gavel and send her away for good, she sat there, her hands resting in her lap, her face unreadable, her posture straight, shoulders squared, not slouching, not shrinking, not giving them what they wanted. She was dressed in a simple gray suit, nothing flashy, nothing that could be twisted against her, nothing that could be used to say she was trying too hard or not trying hard enough. Her lawyer, a middle-aged man named Richard Calloway, sat beside her, flipping through his notes, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin, tense line. He had taken her case because he believed in justice, because he had seen too many stories like this play out the same way, because he wanted to make a difference. But right now, as the prosecution laid out their case, throwing piece after piece of damning evidence into the air like a magician pulling endless scarves from his sleeve, even he was struggling to see a way out. The prosecutor, a sharp-jawed man in an expensive suit, stood before the jury, his voice smooth, confident, the voice of someone who had won this case before it even started. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pacing slowly, glancing at the jury with just the right amount of authority. "This is a case of greed, of betrayal, of a woman who was given everything: trust, a roof over her head, a family who treated her like one of their own, and threw it all away for money. Make no mistake, Vanessa Carter didn't just steal. She planned this. She knew exactly what she was doing." He turned to the judge. "And we have the evidence to prove it." Then, one by one, they presented it. The jewelry box, dusted for fingerprints. Vanessa's were all over it. The security footage, grainy but clear enough, showing her walking toward the master bedroom on the night of the supposed theft. The timestamp lining up with when the jewelry had gone missing. Sue, a witness, a neighbor who claimed she had seen Vanessa acting suspicious in the days leading up to the crime, though she struggled to give any specifics under cross-examination. And then, the final blow, a financial record showing that Vanessa had recently sent money to a family member out of state. It was a completely normal transaction, money she had been saving up for her niece's tuition, but they twisted it, turned it into something sinister. She was desperate, the prosecutor said, shaking his head as if he truly believed his own lies. She saw an opportunity, and she took it. The jury, mostly white, watched her with quiet judgment, their faces unreadable, but their body language screaming their thoughts. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, already convinced. Others nodded along as the prosecutor spoke. A few stole quick glances at Vanessa, but none of them truly saw her. They only saw the story they had been given. The dangerous woman, the ungrateful thief, the liar. Richard Calloway did his best, standing up, trying to poke holes in the evidence, trying to remind the jury that a fingerprint on a jewelry box meant nothing for a woman who had lived in that house for years, that security footage could be edited, that the Holloways had motive to frame her. "She worked for them for 5 years, he said, his voice firm but strained. "She raised their children. She never took so much as a dime that wasn't hers. And now, suddenly, we're supposed to believe she woke up one morning and decided to risk everything. Does that really make sense to you?" The prosecution was smooth, People change. The prosecutor countered with a casual shrug. Temptation is a powerful thing. It was a losing battle, and Vanessa could feel it. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, the weight of every case like hers that had come before. Every time a black woman had been accused, every time the truth hadn't mattered, every time the world had chosen to believe the lie because it was easier, because it fit the narrative they already had in their heads. But still, she sat there, calm. Still, she watched, unmoved, as they twisted her life into something ugly, something unrecognizable. Still, she met the prosecutor's gaze without flinching, without breaking, because she knew something they didn't, because she was playing a game no one else in that room even realized was happening, because Vanessa Carter wasn't just a nanny, and soon. So we're all going to find out exactly what that meant. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the air like static before a storm, a silence so deep it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The prosecution had been relentless, their case airtight, the jury all but ready to deliver their verdict. Vanessa Carter had sat through every accusation, every twisting of the truth, every attempt to strip her of her dignity, and she had done it without a word, without protest, without so much as a flicker of panic in her eyes. But now, as her lawyer stood beside her, as the prosecutor took his seat with the smug certainty of a man who believed he had already won, as the judge adjusted his glasses and prepared to move on, she finally shifted in her chair, leaned forward, and spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, calm, a quiet force cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Your Honor, she said, looking straight at the judge, I think it's time I tell the truth. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, small at first, then growing louder. The judge glanced at her lawyer, who looked just as surprised as everyone else. The prosecutor's smirk twitched at the edges, the confidence in his eyes flickering for the first time. Miss Carter, the judge said, his voice careful, you have the right to remain silent. I would advise, I was never just a nanny. The words stopped everyone cold, the courtroom doors, the reporters scribbling in their notepads, the jury shifting uncomfortably in their seats, everything stilled. Mrs. Holloway's perfectly composed face froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The blood draining from her cheeks so fast, it was almost visible. The prosecutor narrowed his eyes. Excuse me, free? Vanessa exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if she had rehearsed this reveal in her mind 100 times. She turned toward the jury, meeting each pair of eyes with a measured gaze. I was placed in the Holloway home under a different directive, she said. My real employer isn't the Holloways. My real employer is the Central Intelligence Agency. The courtroom exploded. Gasps shot through the room like wildfire. Reporters scrambling to capture the words that had just shattered the entire trial. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order. But no one was listening. The jury members were whispering to each other. Wide-eyed, the prosecutor looked blindsided, his once perfect argument unraveling before his eyes. Richard Calloway turned to his client, barely masking his own shock. Vanessa, he whispered, his voice low, urgent. What the hell is happening? She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on Mrs. Holloway, whose hands were now visibly trembling. Vanessa took a deep breath, her voice unwavering as she continued. 5 years ago, I was assigned to investigate an international money laundering operation that was suspected to be moving illegal funds through high-profile families, using luxury goods and jewelry as part of their network. My role was to integrate into the Holloway household and collect evidence, and I did. Every conversation, every transaction, every meeting, I documented all of it. The prosecutor stood abruptly. Objection. This is outrageous. Your Honor, this woman is lying. But Vanessa only tilted her head, almost as if she had been expecting this. I'm happy to let my superiors clarify, she said. And then the courtroom doors swung open. A group of men in dark suits strode inside with authority, their badges flashing under the fluorescent lights. The murmurs turning into full-blown chaos. The lead agent approached the judge, whispering something into his ear. Before turning toward Vanessa, he gave her a small nod, one of recognition, of confirmation. Miss Carter, he said. We'll take it from here. But it was Mrs. Holloway who reacted the most violently. She pushed back from the table, her chair screeching against the polished floor. This insane, she shouted, her mask of composure finally cracking. She's lying. She's trying to frame me. One of the agents stepped forward, pulling out a document and laying it down on the prosecution's table. We have reason to believe that Evelyn Holloway and her husband have been directly involved in large-scale financial crimes, including fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. He announced, the case against Vanessa Carter is now null and void. In fact, she was never under investigation. You were. The room erupted into pure chaos. Reporters were shouting questions, camera flashes popping from every angle. Mrs. Holloway's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She turned to her husband, who was now sinking in his chair, his face drained of color. The prosecutor looked completely out of his depths. Ostesta, flipping through his files as if the truth wasn't unraveling right in front of him. The agents moved in, placing handcuffs on Mrs. Holloway as she thrashed. Protests wild, desperate. This isn't happening. You can't do this, she screamed. But the more she fought, the more pathetic she looked, the once powerful woman now exposed for what she really was. Vanessa sat still, watching it all unfold, the weight of months, years, of deception finally lifting from her shoulders. The judge, still stunned, adjusted his glasses once more. But he no longer seemed in control of the room. The truth had exploded into the open, and there was no going back. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Vanessa Carter smiled. The judge's gavel struck the bench 3 times, but the noise of the courtroom barely quieted. The weight of the moment was too great, the shift in power too drastic. Just minutes ago, Vanessa Carter had been the accused, sitting in silence as her fate was seemingly sealed. Now, as she stood before the judge, head held high, the same jury that had all but convicted her was staring in stunned disbelief. In light of the new evidence presented, the judge announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs, these all charges against Vanessa Carter are hereby dismissed. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by an explosion of whispers, reporters scrambling to rewrite their headlines, the prosecutor rubbing his temples in disbelief. But the one person who remained frozen in place was Evelyn Holloway. Her perfectly curated image had crumbled, her carefully laid out scheme shattered beyond repair. She had framed Vanessa with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable, believing her wealth and status would protect her as they always had. But now, the cameras that once sympathized with her painted her as the villain. The jury that once looked at Vanessa with suspicion now saw her as the victim, and Vanessa, after everything she had endured, was walking free. She exhaled, steadying herself as she stepped down from the defendant's chair, her hands unclenching for the first time in weeks. Every step toward the exit felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream. As she passed the Holloway's table, she caught a glimpse of Evelyn's face, lips parted in shock, eyes wild with disbelief, the woman who had played the victim now looking utterly powerless. Vanessa paused just long enough to meet her gaze. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no gloating, just quiet certainty. The truth had won. That was enough. She turned away as the FBI agents tightened their grip on Evelyn's wrists, her wails of protest falling on deaf ears. The courtroom doors swung open, and suddenly, she was stepping into the sunlight, the chaos of flashing cameras and reporters' voices filling the air. Vanessa, how do you feel about the verdict? Did you know they would try to frame you? Are you going back to the CIA? Questions fired at her from all directions, but she didn't answer. Not yet. She had spent too long letting others control the narrative. Now, she would decide what parts of her story were told. A black SUV was waiting for her at the curb, and as she climbed inside, she finally allowed herself to breathe. The door shut, blocking out the noise of the outside world. Her reflection stared back at her in the tinted window, and for the first time in a long time, she recognized the woman looking back. She wasn't just the nanny they had tried to paint her as. She wasn't just the accused, the framed, the humiliated. She was an agent, a strategist, a survivor. The voice of her superior crackled through her earpiece. Hell of a show. Carter, she let out a small, tired chuckle. I knew taking this assignment was dangerous, she murmured, resting her head against the seat, but never did I expect to be the one on trial. She glanced down at the classified file resting on her lap, the next mission already in motion, a new target, a new cover. The world thought the story was over, but for Vanessa Carter, it was just beginning. The SUV pulled away from the chaos, disappearing into the city, leaving behind a courtroom forever, marked by the day the truth turned the entire case upside down. Vanessa Carter vanished from the public eye after the case, slipping into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. No social media, no interviews, no tell, All book deal. One day, she was the face of the most explosive courtroom trial in recent history. In the next, she was a ghost. Some say she returned to the CIA, diving into deep cover missions that would never make the news. Others believe she changed her identity completely, leaving behind the life of espionage and betrayal. But every so often, whispers emerge, stories of a woman fitting her description appearing in different corners of the world, always in places where corruption runs deep and justice seems impossible. A hotel manager in Dubai claimed she recognized Vanessa's eyes beneath a new name on a passport. A journalist in Argentina swore he was warned by a mysterious source to abandon a high-profile money laundering investigation just before the entire operation was exposed. Whether she's still out there, working in the shadows, or living a quiet life away from it all. One thing is certain, Vanessa Carter was never just a nanny. She was a force of nature, a woman who turned the tables on those who underestimated her, a survivor who refused to be silenced. In this case, it wasn't just about one woman. It was about resilience, about justice, about the undeniable power of the truth. No matter how deeply someone tries to bury it, how many others have been falsely accused, their lives upended by lies and manipulation. How many have faced discrimination, only to fight back and prove everyone wrong? If you've ever been in a situation where the odds were stacked against you, where the truth felt impossible to prove, what did you do? What would you have done in Vanessa's place? Comment below, share your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation going. And if you think this story was shocking, wait until you hear about the next case, a tale of deception, betrayal, and an ending no one saw coming. Stay tuned, subscribe, and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Either.